Something significant shifted in this conflict overnight, and the gap between what the major outlets are reporting and what the battlefield evidence actually shows has never been wider or more consequential. Surprised. While multiple mainstream broadcasts were still repeating the assessment that Iranian offensive capacity had been degraded by nearly 90%. The sky over central Israel was telling a completely different story. For nearly 3 consecutive hours, explosions, interception trails, and incoming projectiles turned the night sky into a sustained battlefield. Not a probing attack, not a warning shot. A heavy, synchronized ballistic assault directed at the core of Israeli military infrastructure. Size. And it kept going for 180 minutes without stopping. That contradiction between the narrative of near-total Iranian degradation and the reality of the most technically complex bombardment of the entire conflict is the starting point for everything that follows in this analysis. Because understanding the gap between those two descriptions reveals something important about where this war is actually heading and why the assumption that it could be contained may be collapsing. Subscribe to From Report right now and turn on notifications before going any further. The pace at which the operational picture is diverging from official communications means you cannot afford to be behind this analysis when the next development breaks. Unlike a conventional ballistic missile following a predictable arc, the Fatter system carries a maneuvering re-entry vehicle that alters its trajectory during the terminal descent phase. Rather than falling in a straight line toward the target, it shifts course, adjusting its approach path as it descends. In practical terms, that means the interception algorithms suddenly face a moving target rather than a fixed trajectory, and the entire mathematical foundation of the intercept solution becomes unreliable at the moment it matters most. Curious Iranian sources also indicated that the Fatah 2 variant may have been deployed during this operation. That version is reported to carry a hypersonic glide vehicle capable of trajectory adjustments even earlier in flight during the mid-course phase. If accurate, that capability allows the weapon to maneuver long before reaching terminal descent, complicating defense calculations at every phase of the intercept sequence, not just the final, in seconds. Interception systems depend fundamentally on predicting where a missile will be moments into the future. When that prediction becomes uncertain, the entire defensive calculation becomes unstable. Pause. The attack package extended beyond even these two systems. Earlier waves that same day incorporated the Qatar series, the IMOD platform, and the Sigil family. Taken together, that represents 5 distinct missile families deployed in overlapping waves across approximately a 12-hour operational window. Each system operating at different speeds, different altitudes, and different trajectory profiles. Each one calibrated to stress a different layer of the Israeli and American defensive architecture simultaneously. This was not a single lucky projectile penetrating a gap in the shield. It was a carefully structured saturation strategy with a clearly legible objective. Curious overwhelm the defensive architecture across enough simultaneous access that the system eventually breaks down. The targeting logic behind this operation carries its own analytical weight, because Iran's behavior here does not resemble a force firing randomly under desperation. It resembles a military demonstrating graduated operational capability with deliberate precision. According to IRGC official statements, the 37th wave struck several strategic targets simultaneously. Among the most significant was the Glayot Satellite Communications Center south of Tel Aviv, a facility that functions as a critical military communications relay for coordination purposes and which was reportedly struck for the second time in this conflict. Additional strikes were reported against military positions near Beit Yaakov, targets in western Jerusalem, and infrastructure in the Haifa region. The attack package did not remain confined to Israeli territory. Surprised Iranian statements described the operation expanding to include American-linked positions in Erbil and the Iraqi Kurdistan region. More significantly, the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet Headquarters in Bahrain was reported as included in the targeting list. Iranian sources also claimed the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was struck during the operation, along with an American destroyer operating in the Indian Ocean. Curious, those naval claims remain unverified by independent open-source intelligence at the time of this analysis, but the confirmed ground strikes alone present a sufficiently serious operational picture without them. What matters most about the targeting pattern is not any individual strike, but the systematic logic running through all of them. A logic that defense analysts have begun describing as a blinding strategy. Rather than attacking only the assets being defended, the strategy first attacks the systems that make interception possible in the first place. Radar networks, satellite communications relays, early warning detection infrastructure. The eyes of the defensive network rather than the targets the defensive network is protecting. The New York Times published a detailed analysis on March 11th using satellite imagery and verified video footage. Surprised, that analysis identified at least 17 American military-related facilities damaged across the Gulf region. 11 of those sites were confirmed American military installations in Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Several had reportedly been struck more than once. Satellite imagery revealed damage near radar domes and parabolic antenna arrays, some positioned adjacent to TPY-2 radar systems, which serve as the tracking backbone for THAAD missile defense batteries. Those radars function as the eyes of the entire interception network. When radar tracking is disrupted, interceptor missiles cannot accurately calculate their firing solutions. The interception mathematics breaks down at the source rather than at the terminal phase. Senior defense officials were reportedly acknowledging that Iran had adapted its targeting strategy, moving from simply firing missiles at defended locations towards systematically attacking the support systems that make defense possible. In intelligence language, officials describe the results as challenging expectations. That phrase carries a specific meaning in analytical contexts. It means the original assumptions were wrong. It means the threat was underestimated, surprised, and the Pentagon has already acknowledged that it does not have a complete picture of how many Iranian launches remain operational, which means the actual capacity behind these attacks may not yet be fully understood. Now, to the single most significant disclosure to emerge from this entire operational period because it came not from Iranian sources, but from an Israeli Defense Forces press conference. Curious, and what was acknowledged in that briefing changes the strategic equation of this war in ways that have not been adequately communicated in mainstream coverage. According to the IDF report from March 10th, approximately 50% of the ballistic missiles Iran has launched since February 28th were equipped with cluster munition warheads. That single admission immediately transforms the entire strategic calculus of this conflict. Curious, cluster warheads behave in a fundamentally different way from conventional ballistic payloads. A standard warhead produces a single detonation on impact. A cluster warhead does something considerably more complex. At a programmed altitude, the outer casing fractures, and instead of a single explosion, it releases dozens of smaller submunitions. Each bomblet carries several kilograms of high explosive and becomes an independent projectile descending toward the ground. These submunitions can disperse across an impact radius approaching 10 square kilometers. Iran has reportedly been deploying cluster-armed missiles at a near-daily rate since the beginning of the escalation. Independent analysts at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies reinforced that assessment in a technical evaluation published March 11th, reaching a conclusion that was unsettling but operationally logical. Size. As Iranian launchers face degradation from airstrikes, cluster warheads allow each surviving missile to produce exponentially greater battlefield damage. Fewer launches, dramatically larger impact footprint. That shift attacks the foundational logic of missile interception directly. Most people assume that once an interceptor hits an incoming missile, the threat is neutralized. That assumption holds for conventional warheads. Cluster munitions were specifically designed to defeat exactly that kind of thinking. Curious Israel's layered defense network incorporating the Arrow system, David's Sling and Iron Dome, remains one of the most sophisticated missile defense architectures ever constructed. But these systems are designed primarily to track and destroy a single incoming warhead following a predictable ballistic trajectory. Cluster warheads change that equation completely. If the interceptor destroys the missile before it disperses its payload, the threat is neutralized. But if the warhead opens at altitude first, the situation becomes fundamentally more complex. A single incoming target suddenly becomes dozens of independent projectiles, each moving along a slightly different trajectory, each requiring its own interception. Solution: size. No missile defense network currently deployed anywhere on Earth has the tracking and engagement capacity to simultaneously intercept dozens of submunitions released from a single warhead. There is an additional complication that receives almost no attention outside specialized military reporting. Even when a cluster-armed missile is successfully intercepted, the kinetic impact of the interception can fracture the casing rather than vaporize it. When that occurs, the bomblets can scatter unpredictably in all directions, transforming what would otherwise be counted as a successful interception into an uncontrolled dispersal event. The defense system operates on binary mathematics, hit or miss. Cluster munitions operate on distribution. A single warhead can release 20 or more bomb bullets across a lethal area several kilometers wide, regardless of whether the missile itself was technically intercepted. The on-the-ground evidence supports this assessment directly. In the town of Yehud, just outside Tel Aviv, submunitions from a single cluster missile reportedly killed 2 construction workers and seriously wounded another. Size: the workers were outdoors at the time and never had the opportunity to reach shelter. Emergency response teams near Beit Shemesh described arriving at scenes with multiple overlapping blast zones only meters apart. Not a single impact crater, but dispersed explosions distributed across a wide area. The pattern did not resemble a conventional missile impact. It resembled fragmentation raining from altitude across a broad surface area. More than 100 countries have signed international agreements prohibiting cluster weapons specifically because of their indiscriminate nature. Iran, Israel, and the United States are not signatories to that convention. Pause. That fact alone suggests that whatever operational constraints existed at the opening of this conflict may no longer be governing the choices being made. The economic consequences of what is happening militarily are beginning to propagate outward in ways that will reach people with no direct connection to this conflict. Concerned. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of globally traded oil shipments. Any sustained disruption to that corridor immediately affects global energy markets. Multiple shipping companies have already rerouted vessels in response to the escalating risk environment. Supertanker daily rates have reached all-time records. Qatar Energy has curtailed liquefied natural gas production following strikes on its facilities. Approximately 30% of global ammonia production, the nitrogen-based fertilizer that underpins corn, wheat, rice, and soybean cultivation globally, is now at risk from strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure. Spring planting decisions are being made by American farmers right now against a backdrop of supply disruption that will not resolve. 80 quickly. Worried, the Strait of Hormuz has a navigable deep water channel narrow enough that a single sunken supertanker could physically block it. The mines currently being laid in the strait by Iranian forces are not primarily a threat to naval vessels with sophisticated mine countermeasure systems. They are a threat to commercial tanker captains who must decide whether any cargo value justifies the risk of sailing into a mined waterway regardless of naval escort presence. The question for the global economy is not whether American warships can transit the strait. It is whether commercial shipping resumes at the scale required to prevent the structural energy disruption from compounding into something irreversible. If you live anywhere that imports oil, and that is nearly every country on Earth, this is already in your energy prices. If you work in aviation, manufacturing, agriculture, or shipping, This conflict is already in your supply chain. If your retirement account carries exposure to consumer, manufacturing, or airline sectors, you have already absorbed the first wave of repricing. The trajectory of the conflict suggests more is coming. Size. The broader, strategic question that emerges from assembling all of these elements is the one that defense analysts across the ideological spectrum are beginning to ask with increasing urgency. Who is actually controlling the pace of this conflict? Both sides are projecting escalation dumb. In ants. The battlefield reality suggests something considerably more complicated. Curious. The most devastating bombardment of the entire war arrived just days after officials were publicly stating that the threat had been substantially neutralized. That contradiction may be the most revealing data point of the entire conflict. Not because it tells us who is winning, but because it reveals the nature of modern warfare itself. Political narratives move more slowly than battlefield realities, and sometimes the gap between those two worlds becomes the war. The Pentagon does not have a complete picture of how many Iranian launches remain operational. Iranian officials have stated that the missiles used so far are predominantly from the 2012 to 2014 production years. The modern arsenal has not been committed at full scale. 31 waves have been launched, and the IRGC still describes this as the initial phase. Against that backdrop, the assessment that Iranian offensive capacity has been degraded by 90% describes a different conflict than the one producing 180-minute bombardments over central Israel. Size. Israel has responded with large-scale strikes targeting Iranian missile infrastructure and military installations. Hundreds of targets have reportedly been struck since the escalation began. The Israeli Air Force has conducted operations against missile coordination centers, security complexes, and militia Yari bases. Intelligence-guided attacks have attempted to destroy mobile launches before they can fire. But the trajectory of the broader conflict remains deeply uncertain because each wave of strikes appears to expand the scale of the next response rather than diminishing it. Curious. Two questions are worth leaving open for the analytical community watching this situation. First, can layered missile defense architectures keep pace with the convergence of hypersonic speed maneuvering re-entry vehicles and cluster warhead dispersal operating simultaneously? The systems currently deployed were designed against different threat profiles than the ones now being demonstrated in this conflict. The answer to that question will shape defense procurement, alliance structures, and strategic planning across every major military power for the next decade. Curious. Second, are we watching the beginning of a fundamentally new era in the physics of warfare? One where the offensive-defensive balance has shifted in ways that the institutional frameworks governing this conflict have not yet fully processed. The gap between the official narrative and the operational reality is not simply a communications problem. It is a strategic vulnerability when allies, adversaries, and markets are all working from a picture of this conflict that diverges significantly from what the battlefield evidence shows. The decisions being made on the basis of that picture are decisions being made against incorrect assumptions. And in an active conflict, incorrect assumptions have consequences that compound. Size. Subscribe to From Report and turn on notifications. This channel exists to read the primary sources, examine the tactical data, and connect the elements that official communications are keeping separate. The cluster warhead disclosure, the blinding strategy targeting radar infrastructure, the 5 missile families deployed in a single operational window, the launcher survivability problem that American interdiction has not solved. These are not isolated data points. They are components of a coherent Iranian operational strategy that is more sophisticated than the public narrative of near-total degradation accounts for. Curious. When the next wave launches, when the next operational disclosure emerges from an IDF press conference, when the next satellite imagery analysis confirms what the official briefings have not addressed, the analysis will be here. Evidence first, what it means for you. Always leave your assessment in the comments. Can current missile defense technology keep pace with what is being demonstrated in this conflict? Or are we watching the architecture of deterrence being tested in ways it was not designed to survive? Thoughtful. Every response gets read and considered. Pause. This is from report.